Hi everyone, it's Coltra. Today I am doing a lethality assessment program refresher with you. A few weeks ago, Sarah Kroll did a refresher for domestic violence programs and law enforcement agencies. So I've taken that information from her and turned it into something that we can use more aptly at the Bridge to Hope. So all domestic violence is serious, but some situations pose more of a danger than others. With the lethality assessment, we can determine which of those cases are more dangerous for victims and which ones need more immediate attention. The Maryland model, which we in law enforcement use, is an evidence-based assessment where we can gauge the level of danger in an intimate partner situation. Not only that, but it is a way for law enforcement to connect domestic violence victims to domestic violence programs before they leave the scene and really allows victims the opportunity to even know about us. The purpose of the LAP is awesome because it reduces intimate partner homicides. And so with that evidence-based knowledge, we are able to provide intervention where victims are given the opportunity to see themselves, their abuser, and their overall situation through a different lens. The LAP is also an opportunity for us to educate victims about what behaviors to look out for. It can help demonstrate that there is an escalation of violence occurring. It can also explain that the cycle of violence and how there can be good days mixed with very bad days in an abusive relationship. The LAP also enhances cooperation, fosters communication and coordination between law enforcement agencies, domestic violence programs, and other systems in our community. Overall, the LAP is really about victim safety and doing what we can to help a victim of abuse leave a dangerous situation or be given options and a safety plan. So why we do LAP? In the year prior to IPV homicide, more than 44% of those abusers were arrested, and almost 33% of those victims of IPV homicide had contacted the police. So that shows that at least a third of IPV homicide victims have the courage to reach out to law enforcement. But only 4% of those victims ever engaged with or interacted with a DV program or agency. And so when victims are able to connect with a DV agency, it reduces the risk of severe assault by 60%. And so for 28 to 33% of victims, the homicide that they are victim to was the first, or the homicide or attempted homicide was the first physical act of violence. This means that they could be in an abusive relationship with jealousy, cheating, stealing, what have you, all sorts of mental, emotional, verbal abuse. But the first time that there is a physical altercation, they either die or almost die. For every one DV homicide, there are 8 to 9 near homicides. And so this really shows that physical violence isn't necessarily the most accurate predictor that a homicide or attempted homicide would occur. Some of the things that we have in lethality assessment wouldn't be classified as crimes, such as jealousy or possessive acting when there are children outside of the relationship. And so gauging the danger of the situation obviously doesn't magically reduce the danger, but it is an opportunity for us to educate victims and refer them to a domestic violence program. And so the essential elements of the LAP is the hotline call. Law enforcement arrives, take care of the situation, talk to the victim, and then call us. It's really awesome when we get to talk to victims, but obviously it is their choice. They get to decide if they talk to us or not. And so it's also really important that law enforcement, and if we get the opportunity to talk to victims, um, to emphasize the danger of the situation that they are in. With the scoring, even if somebody doesn't score in as high risk, an officer's gut feeling may indicate that they are high risk despite the way that they answered the question. So officers cannot downgrade a score to make them low risk or non-high risk, but they can make a non-high risk victim a high risk victim by, just seeing the situation, or maybe understanding that they are not answering these questions accurately. But it is really law enforcement's job and our job in that situation to empower victims. It is their choice to participate in the lethality assessment entirely. They do not have to answer any questions. They do not need to talk to us. They don't need to talk to law enforcement. They could refuse to participate with law enforcement in their interaction. Um, and so it's really important that we focus on choice and empowerment to give survivors a piece of confidence and control after a situation that they had none. And so here is what the lethality assessment looks like. Um, it's all the same questions. It might be formatted a little bit differently depending on which agency is using it. But it's really important that you don't forget to fill out the top section when taking a lab call. It is really important that we have the town, city, and village as far and what questions they answered yes, no to, any questions that they didn't answer. That is all information that we use when I track the lethality assessments through end abuse. And then also in the bottom, make sure that you are indicating whether or not you talked to the victim and whether or not they gave consent for their information to be shared. Now, because of Marcy's Law, we are putting only initials on these assessments, but if you could put your name, or if you could put their name either in an email to me on the back of the page or something, so I'm not calling somebody without knowing their name, but still knowing these intimate details about a really scary moment in their life. And so once you have completed the lab call, either give it to me or put it in my mailbox, please. And so this is the script that law enforcement uses when conducting a lethality assessment. Is it okay if we go through these questions so that we can get a better sense of the situation? It can be helpful to look out for things when things escalate. Some of these questions are scary, but it's important but it is your choice to participate, and you can stop whenever you choose. We also cannot share your responses without your consent. And so on our end, these are some reminders when we are taking a lab call. For law enforcement, the situation is volatile and dynamic. It's anything could change, anything could happen in the situation. Neighbors might get involved, other family members might come home, anything could happen. So it's important to remember that police are in the home or near the home or wherever the altercation occurred. Um, it's not always possible to make an arrest, so the offender could be nearby or under arrest. It's always best case that we can completely remove the offender and the victim from the same situation. If we can separate them, that is 100% what we want to do. Obviously, we're not law enforcement, so we don't have control over that. We have to depend on law enforcement to do that for us. But because the situation can be so volatile and dynamic and traumatic, the victim may not be ready to talk to us and may not listen. Law enforcement is also kind of, whether or not intentionally they are putting some pressure on victims to get into services quicker. And also because the situation is so traumatic, a lot of victims may not be able to listen to us. They may want to talk to us, but they are not mentally, emotionally, or maybe even physically in a space that they can listen to us and really take in the information and safety planning that we're trying to do with them. And so now we will walk through the steps of taking a lap call. So number one, you want to gather information from the officer, then build a rapport, reiterate the danger of the situation, educate and safety plan, and then finally encourage victims to come into our services. And I do have a note here to double check if the victim wants to speak with you while you are talking to the officer. They might change their mind, and that, we always want to talk to the victims. That increases the likelihood that they will come into services and accept this intervention. So one of the first things that you should do is you should introduce yourself to the officer. Make sure that you get their name and get the victim offender initials, get where it's happening, that whole top section of the paper. And then ask the officer to go through the positive responses of the lethality screen and then track them. You should also be tracking if any questions were not answered. If the victim decided that they wanted to stop midway through or they didn't want to answer that question, that should be indicated. And then the officer probably has already done it at this point, but make sure that you get a description of the situation and then write that on the lethality screen. That is also then your chance, once you have all the information, to ask if the victim is willing to speak with me. Make sure you do that because they may have changed their mind. Once you are able to speak with the victim, thank them. It is their choice to speak with you. Show some appreciation for that. It is really important to mirror the victim's language. They might not identify that they're in a domestic violence relationship. They might not identify that their boyfriend or fiance or husband is an abuser. And they may be experiencing a lot of emotions. They could be going from high to low to aggressive to defensive and anything and everything in between. So be empathetic, normalize their behavior, their responses, and express that you admire them for being willing to speak with you and being willing to engage in something that will better their situation. Explain that we are absolutely 100% confidential and that we have free services. Explain that we can't tell law enforcement about our conversation that we're having and that we will not send them a bill for anything that they do. And then also let them know that you and the officer are working together to support them and that you are both concerned for the victim's safety. That's where knowing the officer's name can be really helpful. It is also really important to reiterate the danger of the situation. Law enforcement tells high-risk victims, people in similar situations to yours have been killed before. And so you can repeat that to a victim. It's kind of a jarring phrase to say, but you absolutely can say that to a victim survivor that you're speaking with on a lap call. When you do that, reference specific information that the victim has shared with you, as far as, a pattern of behavior or threatening, and that can all change. You can go from threats to physical violence very quickly. And also explain that, you're kind of an expert in this. You work with survivors. You do work in domestic violence, and that situations like this are very dangerous for individuals. And also to explain that victims, maybe you can't see the danger that you're in because you're so close to it. Would you be willing to come into a shelter and take a step back to see how dangerous the situation is? Because a lot of times people really can't see what they're so close to, especially when they're so used to it. When you've lived in abuse for years, it's hard to identify it as abuse. And it's really easy to normalize those dangerous situations. And so this is what you can say to a high risk victim. I'm not saying this to scare you, but people in similar situations to yours have been killed. Do you want to go? Can we go through some of these specific responses that you gave me? I have some concerns. And so doing this really helps um, engage with the victim and identify specific issues rather than just saying, you're in an abusive relationship, you should seek help. This is our chance to engage with victims and really point out some big red flags that maybe they can't see. And so there are sometimes where law enforcement might call a non-high danger lap, um, which is totally fine. That's actually probably really good if law enforcement calls in a non-danger lap, non-high danger lap. There's really no harm that can be done in doing that. It just allows us the opportunity to connect with somebody who might need our services or need somebody to talk to. You can still safety plan. You don't need to, you know, explain to them that people in their situation have been killed before, because that's not necessarily true. But explaining the escalation and cycle of violence and safety planning can be really helpful for these 9 high danger victims as well. And so when we are talking to victim survivors on a lap call, it's really important to explain IPV, you know, emphasizing that it is not the victim's fault. This is an issue of power and control. Just because that there's anger, alcohol, or drugs does not mean that if those things did not exist, that your situation would be okay again. Yes, they absolutely can make a bad situation worse, but they are not the crux of the problem. Um, Intimate partner violence is a recurring thing. It happens in a cycle. It comes worse and worse and more frequent and more often. And it doesn't have to be physical violence in intimate partner relationships. It could be controlling, possessive, jealous behaviors, which are just as dangerous. And as we know as advocates, the verbal, mental, and emotional abuse that people go through is just as, if not more, degrading to a person. And so here is some visualizations of the stages of change and the cycle of violence. So we can use these as examples to go through with people when we are taking lab calls. It is also really important to make sure that you are matching your safety planning strategies to the situation. And so if they are willing to let the abuser stay, or the abuser's not arrested, or what have you, um, and they live together, saying that you should get a security system or this, that, or the other, really, they're already in the home. If they are living together and consenting to live together at that point, you should be making safety plans as far as a safe word to text, a code word to use on the phone, things like that, where we are able to still connect and safety plan despite how close or far the danger is. And we really want to focus about immediate safety, especially if law enforcement isn't able to arrest an abuser right away. Do they need to come into shelter? Do they want to come in and get a restraining order? What can we do to make you feel safe and better about your situation right now? And so, again, reiterating that our services are free and confidential. We don't have to say anything to law enforcement about what we just talked about. We don't have to, I'm not going to call your mom. I'm not going to call your sister. I'm not going to call, I'm not going to call anybody and tell them that this happened to you. This stays within our agency and it's not going to go anywhere. And also just reiterating that you don't, if you want to call and talk to us, if you want to use our food pantry, if you need a gas card, we're not going to send you a bill later. And it's really important to set up a follow-up opportunity with a victim. If that follow-up opportunity is not set, it's really hard to do a follow-up. And so when we encourage these victims to come into services and to use our follow-up opportunities and services, we can offer specific things. We can meet at the library. Do you need to, oh, you work 12-hour shifts? How about if we meet after your shift? We can make that happen. You're short on food. Okay, awesome. We have a food pantry. Oh, we also have gift cards too. And making appointments with people. Don't just say like, oh, I have an appointment set for you tomorrow at 3 with our victim advocate. Say, no, hey, how about you come in and meet with Angie? Angie's really compassionate. She knows what she's doing and she would love to talk to you. Or how about Jen? Jen knows all of her, Jen has been doing this for a few years now. She really understands domestic violence well, and I think that she would be a really good person for you to talk to. Giving people specific names helps to take out a lot of fear of coming in and a lot of fear out of the scary situation. Um, and so we can also tell people that we have a support group. If you don't want to come in and talk to us but want to participate in support group, that's absolutely fine. And while you're at support group, guess what? Your kids also have a support group that they can attend at the same time. And so once you have gone through all those steps, you can conclude the call. Overall, the lap call should take only about 10 minutes. Oftentimes, most of the time, the calls are placed on an officer's phone. And so once you have concluded the call, summarize your plan with the victim, and make sure that you have accurate contact information and that you have consent for somebody to follow up with them. Then talk to the officer, let them know about a safety plan, and thank them. If the victim wants to talk to you some more, either you can call them back afterwards or they can call you back afterwards. That is absolutely okay. Just because lap calls should be a short amount of time doesn't mean that we can't still continue to talk to somebody, especially after they just experienced something really traumatic. And make sure to indicate or to let them know that our number does show up as a blocked number. And so if a victim does not want to speak to us, it's their choice if they want to or not. But the law enforcement should still be calling us when there is a high risk situation. And so if the victim's not willing to speak with us, we can still safety plan through the officer. We can still offer services. We can still offer everything, with a middleman. And so you could even set up a follow-up appointment, through an officer, and make sure to safety plan through an officer. All of these things, may be a bit more clunky and awkward with an officer as a middleman, but we can still connect with victims and advocate for victims and connect them to services, even if we don't get to speak to them directly. And so here are some victim privacy rights and concerns and how those are impacted by LAP and the intricacies of that. So we should be aware that law enforcement oftentimes wears body cameras. So when this happens, they should be making sure to take a step away or walk away from the victim so that the victim can have a private conversation with us. Of course, we can't control law enforcement, but keeping that in mind. And of course, victims can refuse any part of the lethality screen. Like I said before, it is entirely up to them to participate in any of this. We also need to make sure that we are getting consent and permission to receive contact information and names and things about the situation. Just because somebody is willing to talk to law enforcement doesn't necessarily mean that they want to talk to us. And that us contacting them when they don't want to can really possibly push them further away from seeking services. And so with Marsy's Law, there's obviously several other laws as far as victim rights and victim privacy. So Marsy's Law ultimately has not changed LAP very much. Most of victim rights laws were already, you know, they already applied to the lap. Marcy's Law specifically changed, putting initials rather than names on the sheet. But other than that, not much has changed. And so this again, making sure that we are looking at what protections we can make for victims. And so not our agencies, I don't think, hopefully, have really made big changes with Marcy's Law. But as I said, they should still be sharing information with us. They should still be calling us when there is a lap. Just because Marcy's Law exists doesn't mean that we stop sharing information. And so again, making sure that we have consent from the victim to have their contact information and consent to follow up. And right here, it's saying that when making a lap call, victims can speak with us anonymously. We don't have to know their name. That is their choice and their right to inform us of that. And so here are some data expectations that we can expect with LAP. Half to 61% of LAP screens should be high danger. And about 50 to 70% of the times, victims are not going to want to speak with us. And that's okay. That's up to them. And only 29 to 45% of high danger victims who speak with an advocate will go to service. And so this isn't anything to deter us from doing LAP. It's just showing that it really, a lot of how we are able to connect and help victims really depends on them wanting our help. And so this is a quote that Sarah Kroll had in the original slides, indicating we just needed someone to notice those red flags that we were just completely missing. And so that again is referencing the idea that you can't see something that you're so close to. A lot of times you need a different perspective to take a step back and understand how many red flags are happening. So thank you all for listening to this and getting some more out of it, hopefully. If you have any other questions, feel free to bring them to me because questions can only make you smarter. And another shout out to Sarah Kroll for putting all this information together and really making sure that everybody understands and does the lap well. Thank you.